Hi there, I'm Trevor Coote, and this is Business is Fucking Hard, the podcast where business owners pull back the curtain and talk about the realities of owning a business. We'll hear their stories, learn some lessons, and have some fun along the way. Thanks for joining us. On today's episode, we are joined by Bailey Parnell. Bailey is the founder and CEO of Skills Camp, a soft skills training company. As a speaker, podcast host, and consultant, Bailey also works with companies to apply her learnings in leadership development. Bailey is currently working on her PhD in education, where her research focus is how AI can help leaders and aid in human skills development. I hope you enjoy this episode. Bailey Parnell, welcome to the podcast.
Trevor, my friend, thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here. Enough conversation coming up. I'm looking forward to where this might go. I was just sharing with you before we jumped in that as I get into this podcast, I'm realizing that there's opportunity for the conversations not to be as prescriptive as I had kind of envisioned when I said the podcast. And I'm really looking forward to just letting it be a little bit organic and free flowing and see where we end up based on your bit of experience, but also and the different avenues that you can bring to it. But we'll get started. Please.
In a way, you're already touching on one of the things about business that is hard, which is that I would consider this part of the business of Trevor, and you have had to learn as you go and adapt and figure it out. And that's not easy.
Right. Yeah. And that is so often it comes up in our conversation in the interview with people is the lessons that are learned through business are so much more just by doing rather than the education or anything that might prepare us for the business environment. So let's get started as I do with the question, what was your into business, to the business world, to entrepreneurship? Where did that journey start for you?
That's a good question, because I used to say that I never really grew up wanting to be an entrepreneur. There were no entrepreneurs around me. My parents didn't even graduate high school. So in terms of what my future was, it was kind of carte blanche. And but then, when I do look back now, I think back to being like 6 or 7 years old, there may have been early signs, because when I was on summer break with my sisters and we wanted to save up money, maybe we were like wanted to buy a shirt, or I don't know what we wanted to do with the money then. But what we did was I actually sold freezies. So we would sell frozen freezies, and myself and my younger sister. So first off, we had to like do some chores, and my dad would say, "Oh, you have to save up at least, I don't know, let's say $12 in order to buy the big thing of frozen freezies. This is your investment." Right. And my dad, even though my dad wasn't an entrepreneur, I think he didn't know that he was teaching us entrepreneurial skills. So then we bought the freezies, we had a cooler, there was a wagon, and then we would run around the neighborhood selling the freezies. And my sister, I like to think, was my first marketing team, because she would be on the back of the cooler yelling, "Freezies, freezies." And so then I think at one point we did lemonade. And so I suppose it may have been there all along, but fast forward into puberty and young adulthood, and I didn't really see myself as an entrepreneur. Yet oddly, the way that it happened was that I was working at what is now called Toronto Metropolitan University. And I essentially just saw a problem that I felt needed to be solved, and felt that I was the best person to solve the problem. And entrepreneurship was truly born out of this being the best way to exercise that solution. Like, I suppose I'll tell y'all a little bit about what that problem and solution were, but I was working in student affairs, which is kind of everything outside the classroom that supports student success. So things like health and wellness departments and career centers and learning support and housing and community and skill building, and really what I would now call, the soft skills development of the person outside the classroom. And it was very clear that the students who were using these services were much more successful, but the reality was that most weren't. And frankly, the employees also needed those services. And they were becoming employees that
Right.
didn't have these requisite skills to succeed. And I'm thinking, wait, I work with the Career Center because I serviced all these departments. And I thought, employers are literally asking for ability to work well with others, ability to communicate well, emotional intelligence. Why is it not being taught in the classroom? And because I had this unique background, and some of your listeners may have met the co-founder at the time, Hamza Khan, we just thought, well, okay, nobody's teaching these glaringly important skills, these things we might call soft skills or transferable skills, but they are skills. I happen to know this because we are teaching them at the university. So obviously, I'm just going to have to teach them. and that's where the entrepreneurship was born in a more formal way.
Right. So, how long ago was this? What kind of time frame are we talking?
That would have been around the end of 2015, beginning of 2016 era. So almost a decade ago.
Yeah. And like your involvement at that point wasn't to go in. The expectation wasn't for you to find those gaps and be able to fill them. What did that look like for you to pitch? Like, were you pitching an idea to kind of the administration on campus to say, look, this is missing, I can fill that gap? Or was it you just started offering services and people would sign up? Or was it on the sly?
It's a great question, because I do run into a lot of other entrepreneurs now, and especially entrepreneurs of color and women entrepreneurs, where for other reasons that probably have nothing to do with them, they've been socialized to think that you need to have an extreme level of competence in order to be able to confidently go and offer these services. And it honestly could have been because of my age at the time. I don't know, but there was never a, well, maybe I should ask the university if I can offer these services.
Right.
In fact,
okay.
I'll have to tell you about one of the hard parts of business was when I got in trouble for conflict of interest.
Okay. So this is, yeah.
Yeah. So we'll get there. But at first, what happened was that part of my role and Hamza's role was actually, we didn't have this role at other universities. We literally went to these departments under, one time we were called the creative unit. At one point we were called the innovation unit. I think they called it special projects eventually. But because it was housed very specifically within student affairs, we helped these departments kind of co-create and update and innovate their programming. So then we would actually go to all these conferences, and we would share all the things that our university was doing and building and working on as successes. But this is part of the thing that might have just been serendipitous, is that higher ed is, especially in Canada, is a little bit different. Once students choose the school, you're not really competing with other universities. Like, you're kind of just all helping each other because the student chose the school. It's kind of like, okay, well, how do we all make better career services for our students? Like, how do we all, you're doing really cool things with social media, which is kind of where I spent a lot of time. How do we all do this? But this actually opened up a business opportunity for Hamza and I very early on. The business opportunity, to your point in the question, was when we were going all around talking about, hey, what we're doing, communication programs, personal branding, networking, interviewing, all these things, the other universities started coming to us and asking us to do it at their university. Now, eventually we were like, this was happening alongside this problem identification I told you about. And then slowly, our friends would become people who work in an organization. And it was like, okay, well, they're like, hey, I liked that personal branding thing that you did. Can you come do it for my team? And we were like, okay, yeah, sure. Of course we'll do it. And so we've just built it out. And Skills Camp was the name of the business. It was bootstrapped because it was the kind of service that could be offered via time. That was really the main investment that it required upfront, was time and effort, and a lot of free or low cost tools like Google Slides, and your ability to do research is something that is more time investment than it was financial. So we were able to build up a bit of a bank and then do the next thing, and then get the website, and then offer a few more talks, and then, move forward that way.
Right. So Skills Camp as a business, at what point going in, so you're working at I'm still having trouble with the name change, Toronto Metropolitan University. So you're working there, you've identified this gap, you start working with the departments to fill that gap. At what point do you see this as, okay, this is a business? This is something that we're setting up as, we're going to set up as skills camp and start an LLC or whatever the incorporated entity
no,
is.
it's a good question, because there was that complication I told you about that happened a little bit later, where we had to have a conflict of interest conversation, because I just think that I happened to also, opportunity preparation, all these things. I benefited from when I was at my early days as a student. So I also went to school at Toronto Metropolitan University, in addition to having worked there full time afterwards. And as I was coming up as a student, Sheldon Levy was the president of the university. Now, this man literally said, I want my students to graduate with a degree in one hand and a business in the other. So he had this very entrepreneurial mindset that clearly found its way into the way that even the employees were thinking about a kind of intrapreneurship. How do you innovate from within? And so, oh my gosh, this sounds funny now, but I didn't even give my employer a choice. Like, we just started this on the side, and it was like, well, the way I saw it then and even now is that I had the business of Bailey. Bailey is Bailey, and my full-time job just happens to be my biggest client right now. But I'll probably do some consulting. I mean, nowadays it's like, oh, consulting, writing, everybody's got 5 things under their portfolio. So no, we didn't even give them a choice. The way that we did it, though, at least what I felt was honorably, was we didn't do work with in our department, right? Because that was my full-time job. So we did that work under our role. And even if other people at Ryerson came to us, TMU, if they came to us, we were like, no, go work with student affairs. So then there was this, so here's the story, is that what happened was, it's a very obviously a big university, and other parts of the university, not just other departments, but other academic elements and whatnot, there was a first time where they came to skills camp. And I thought I was doing the right thing at the time. I mean, now I could just be like, oh, I should have just said no. But what happened was, God's honest truth, I still remember the exact gig. They wanted a 1-hour networking keynote. It was on the idea of networking and relationship building. They wanted it in orientation. It was a master's program, and they wanted me. And I said to them, do you know that your career center does this for free? Because I worked for the school. So I felt like that was my way of being like, no, I got to let them know, this is what my department does. You need to know that you can get this for free. And they said to me, yes, we know, we use the Career Center and we use them all year. We just want an external, more a keynote style to come in and inspire the students to go use it. So I was like, okay, sure. In my head, I had done my duty. So I don't know. What happened though was there was somebody who worked for the Career Center at that orientation, obviously. And they went back to their boss, who was like, why is Bailey doing this? And then their boss went to my boss, and then my boss went to me and was like, what are you doing? So then I was called into a meeting with HR, union representation, and my bosses. And we had to talk about what we do at Skills Camp and what we are allowed to do. And this was probably, to be honest, a year, maybe even a year and a half into the business, right? It just had not come up before, because everything was happening outside of work, really. And it ended up working out in my favor, I think, in the end, because the rules ended up being, you are not allowed to take business that is within the purview of what was then called Ryerson Student Affairs. And why that worked in my favor was because I thought, okay, that is one department of one university in one city. And that's perfect.
Right.
Because I know some friends that work for the government that are not allowed to take any single paid gig outside of their role. So I'm like, all right, that works for me. And then there was actually a level of transparency with my boss. And wow, you're bringing me back to all these stories that I haven't told in so long. But there was another time where I thought that I was going to have to quit, and I had to go full time with Skills Camp sooner than I actually even wanted to. A little bit later, I hope people hear this too, because there's all these different ways to get into business and to start business. But I worked for that organization for 2.5 years before going full time with my business. And I promise you, I would put every metric down. They were absolutely more than happy with my performance there. It was very good performance. In fact, part of me felt like I had to exceed performance there so that I could justify spending time, building this business. And at one point, I got this contract from the Bank of Canada that was the biggest contract that we had at that point. And it was going to require me to go to Ottawa for 2 weeks straight because I was in Toronto. And I had to work up the courage, and I went to my boss, and it was the kind of contract where I was like, I'm doing this. And my cards in my side were like, if I have to quit, then I have to quit. It was one of those contracts. But I actually didn't want to. Like I was down to go do this, down to use my vacation, take whatever, and just do this and return. But then, so I sat down with my boss, and I'm like, here's the situation. But because there had been that level of transparency before, she was like, it's okay. Like, it's okay.
Right.
We'll figure it out. And what it ended up being was actually 2 weeks of unpaid leave. And I was totally fine with that because I was going to be making money from this contract anyways. And I ended up coming back and staying like over a year longer there. So because they were willing to permit me that freedom, they had, they could have had immediate turnover in that moment, but they were able to, work it out. Eventually, I did go full time with my business, but because it was my own business, I was able to give them like 6 months advance warning and hire the next person and train them.
Right. I think like all of that story is true to form for people who are balancing that, exploring the opportunity to get into business, but need the time with other, employment, financial stability in order to get that business off the ground. And then certainly that conflict of interest piece we see a lot in kind of the tech environment, right? Somebody that has a good idea. Where does the IP, where does the intellectual property sit? Who owns the intellectual property that I'm coming up with as I innovate on the side? And that's kind of where you were at, right? Is you're innovating and creating an opportunity to fill a gap for the university, but where does that and I mean, probably the conversation happened a little bit further down the road than it may have should have been or whatever. But once it happened, then you kind of establish that understanding with the university. Okay, I can fill this gap. This is our company. This is what we're doing as an enterprise. And this is where the intellectual property, the ideas can sit, and ownership of those can sit. So I think like that story really, for a lot of people that are exploring business and entrepreneurship, I think that really lays out well kind of that balance of, this is my world today. This is where I want to get to. How do I kind of navigate all of that?
Yeah, you're right. And there is, some elements of this story that you kind of mentioned there that I think are really important to point out to people. This may have been a very different story for me if I was working for a private education firm. Because exactly right. So I didn't, circumstances that I could not have pre-planned for myself. I did not know that ahead of time. So sometimes in life, it's just that these circumstances unfold for you, and you've got to have that preparation in order to see the opportunities as they come for you. In a publicly funded institution, the university, like if I went and did professional development and I got even smarter and better at whatever I was studying, I could bring it back to the students and make my job better there. In a way, that was kind of part of my job, to go be better at this and make it easier for the university as a publicly funded institution, and not even on their dime, right?
Right.
So in a way that kind of helped them a little. They don't go sell that IP. They continue to change that IP to make it better for students as students change. So that could have been a different story had I worked in a private education institution. However, you know, I find I am seeing more and more with private companies, they're like the support of side hustles, if you will.
So you're even private companies, you're saying they're giving a little bit more autonomy to employees to go out and be innovative on their own, allowing them to do something that might be, to what extent though? Like, would you?
I was going to say, it could just be my bubble. I don't want to say that with authority. I'm just noticing it more because this gig economy, or, I mentioned earlier, actually a couple of times now, that I see this as part of the business of Trevor, this podcast, and how you exercise that business. Or, my full-time work was the biggest client of Bailey at that time, but Bailey was also a speaker and also wanted to do these other things.
Right.
Now I see that mentality on the rise. And honestly, I think like even the idea of a 40-hour gig, this might be radical to some people listening, but I don't know if that's going to be a thing for less and less people. How about that?
Yeah, right.
I think in the future, like generations, I like to think they see entrepreneurship a little bit differently because they have seen people sell stuff on Instagram and Etsy literally forever.
Right.
Why are they not entrepreneurs? They are entrepreneurs, right? So they're all business owners. If you see yourself that way is a different question.
Yeah. I just wonder who's supporting all of that. There's a more macro environment that really has to get tipped over in order for that to be, truly sustainable at every level. But,
that's a good point. Like, how do you set up employment contracts? Well, you know what? This happened long. This is not happening in the future. This actually is a conversation of the past as the gig economy rose and more people hire contractors. For example, most of skills camp is actually made up of contractors, but they do not work full-time hours. They are also the business of them. I think where you get into dicey territory is when they're working full-time hours and acting as a full-time person. That's not coming in for a couple of hours a week on this one project that ends, right?
Yeah. I just finished a Canadian tax law for my Master of Laws degree from York University, and it was as exciting as it sounds. But the defining employee versus contractor gets very, very muddy.
That's right.
Everything in the tax statute gets very, very muddy.
Oh, it's going to get muddier. Don't you worry.
Yeah. Well, and I like that perspective though, because I think that people as business owners, as people who have established businesses or are establishing businesses, knowing that there's more opportunity to explore kind of that gig, that contractor environment, maintaining a little bit of a arm's length from kind of that employee environment might be a huge advantage for a lot of people. That structure within business is really one of the major challenges always.
100%. I mean, that I would consider very organic growth. Like if you're like me, you didn't have a trust fund that you could spend to hire the best people straight out of the gate. And part of the way I knew my first and second hire was because that role that important first hire was someone who is now my manager or head of operations, actually started as 15 hours a week executive business assistant. And then it was like, oh, well, you know what? You're doing a lot. Actually, it needs to be more. It's like 20 hours a week. Okay, well, 30. Okay, well, now we're at 30 hours. So maybe this is just a full-time job. Oh, now you're like expanded. Now she's just head of all of operations, right? So in a way, that 15 hours a week was like as a contractor, was a lot easier for people to wrap their head around, for you, whoever's listening, to try your idea or to just try it yourself. Like, I guess it depends on what the idea is. Like, do you need to save up capital ahead of time? Like, all this sort of stuff.
Yeah. You say whoever's listening, it's probably, friends of yours and Hamza and
Sure,
that's about it.
we're happy to share it.
We're,
Absolutely.
we're still growing. So I do want to dive into a little bit of applying some of your learning, some of those pieces, those soft skill pieces to business ownership, taking away from, like expanding beyond just what you're experiencing at the university and in that post-secondary environment, and looking to more of the business, the private enterprise environment, and those soft skill pieces. But before we get there, I do want to talk about risk and just what was your appetite? What did it cross your mind as you started to navigate into, okay, I'm starting this business. We've gotten past kind of the conflict of interest. We had that conversation. We know what our role is. We know what the opportunities are. At any point, did you have in the pit of your stomach kind of going, what if this doesn't work? What if there's too much pressure, or I can't afford to the growth that we're seeing, or was that ever kind of a part of the narrative?
I felt I had a low risk tolerance, actually. But that doesn't mean a financial risk tolerance. So this kind of manifested in a couple of ways. I actually feel that my risk tolerance has really only lowered like this year. My tolerance. It's improved. How about that? It's improved like probably literally just this year. And I realized a big part of it had to do with my relationship with money and living, like kind of growing up poor. Some people, I have seen two different outcomes from this, by the way. I was an entrepreneur that was like, no, like I need to make sure that I can pay rent and blah, blah, blah. And like all these kind of worries. But I have also known entrepreneurs that grew up poor that said to them like, oh no, they have such a high risk tolerance because they've been poor. They know they can do that.
Right.
And so it had different effects on us. I happen to be a bit more conservative, and that is probably the reason I was staying at why I stayed at the university for 2.5 years before going full time, was that I wanted to make sure that I had enough in the bank account to afford me for at least a year. And at what I was making then. And the reason why was because I knew myself 100%. And to your point, I knew that if I was worried about eating, I was not going to be in the best place to be focusing on the business. So that's why I had to do it a little bit of a different way. I did have a conversation with a mentor at the time that helped me reframe the risk, though. And I said, I do want to go full-time with Skills Camp. He said, you have clients and it's obviously working. Like, do you think you can make more money if you go full-time? And I was like, yeah, if you give it your full energy. And he said, then why aren't you? He's like, what are you afraid of? And I was like, okay, well, he said, okay, what's worst case scenario? Talk me through that. And I said, well, worst case scenario would be that I deplete the money there. We don't make enough new money. And like, I can't pay my rent. And then he said, and then what? And I was like, well, I guess I would have to I'd probably have to move back in with my dad in Brampton, which is about, 45 minutes outside Toronto. And I was like, that was worst case scenario to me. And he's like, and would they feed you? And I was like, yes. And he's like, and would you have a place to sleep? He's like, yes. So then from his perspective as a much more successful entrepreneur, he was like, so then you would have a place to eat and sleep. And for at least a little bit, like, and you're very employable, you could probably find another job. And I was like, yeah. And he's like, okay. So then it actually, the whole conversation made me reframe the risk, which was that what I considered worst case scenario, this other entrepreneur was like, so then you just do it again. It made me realize that what I was actually fearing, which I don't have, as again, probably shed a lot of that literally this year. What I was probably fearing was failing publicly and having to tell people why this didn't work. But obviously I did it anyway. So
yeah, I've had that conversation with a few different people on the podcast. Is this kind of when you're younger, you have a little bit more of that resilience just because there's this, if I mess this up, I can come back. right?
Mhm.
I've got lots of time to come back. And that just
True.
gives you a little bit more of that risk appetite is kind of, and I assume as both of us get older, that diminishes to an extent. Okay. So let's
I don't know if it
shift a little bit.
diminishes because,
Oh, please.
sorry to interrupt you. Yeah.
No.
Hums and I actually are starting another business, and we're also expanding the current one. And I got to tell you, I feel like I'm doing it from much more of a place of calm and intellect and less fear of risk. Maybe because I've done it now, but I actually feel like I care. I wonder if it's because I moved to New York. Like, people just care a lot less here. But it's like, I care a lot less about what anybody thinks about anything that I do. So I'm like, if it fails, oh well. Like, I'm still going to be, as of next year, I'll still be a doctor. I'll still be able to get a job. And Hamza said to me, same conversation again. Our worst case scenario is a lot different now. My worst case scenario now is that suddenly, like, all my businesses fail and I'd probably go work as a professor. I'd probably go work in like academia again because I really enjoy it. And I'm like,
Right.
that's not terrible. Okay.
Yeah.
It hits
Yeah.
different, I guess.
No, I for sure. And I think they're almost, I feel like they might be two different things. That risk appetite to go out on a limb where you don't have any of the, you're biting off a lot more than you think you even have the support to maintain. So there's a financial risk element. You're doing something much bigger. You go out and take a $2 million loan at the bank in order to start something brand new. And if it doesn't work, you're financially wiped out. Versus what you're talking about, which I think also happens as we get older, is this environment of, I just don't care what people think of me anymore. I'm not as worried about kind of that perception. And that's really like a big part of the podcast has been around the writings that I did related to Business is Fucking Hard. But like, people put on this front, right? We feel like there's this need for us to show to the world that we're resilient and our business is fine and everything's good, and there's judgment if it's not. And if everybody knew that every business was kind of on the same playing field, that judgment gets taken away to an extent. And I think more and more that's changing. I think the consumer is getting a little bit more empathetic towards business owners. COVID did that. But I think business owners are finding themselves being able to be a little bit more vulnerable in general, and I think there's an appetite for that. I hope anyway.
Yeah.
So speaking of vulnerability, let's talk about. I want to tie some of your doctorate learning around. Well, maybe not. So I might have misspoke there. I think your doctorate learning is more on the technology AI piece, but maybe more your understanding, having been out talking to businesses and part of the soft skills piece around emotional intelligence, around kind of those soft skills in business leadership positions. Do you see? I'll just say, I've seen over time, or my sense is that business leaders are moving from kind of this stoicism, steadfast kind of environment, and even a decade and a half ago, that was the expectation that somebody, a business leader, needed to be stoic. And now we're really leaning on that vulnerability. There's an expectation that business leaders have this emotional intelligence that allows them to open up to various audiences, whether it's their staff or stakeholders or whomever. Is there any truth to that? But also, where do you align? Like, what does all of your experience kind of line up with that?
Yeah, well, you want to talk about a hard part of business. When we go into businesses, we are brought in very particularly for the hard part, that is people. And when people come together to do anything, literally anything, collaborate with two or more people, there are going to be people problems or challenges, right? And a lot of these people problems, the hard part of business, certainly come from leadership, and They come from leadership as a problem and as a potential solution, because when leaders come to us, some of their hard parts of business is dealing with their people. And very often this has to do with, those stoic leaders that you mentioned. Very often those leaders were put in place because they were good at something. That's how they became the top of the department. But that doesn't mean that they had any of the skills to do what their new job required of them, which probably changed overnight, which was to lead other people. So even if they got any training, which, by the way, a lot of them don't have, by the way, any training at all about people leadership. And that's not an exaggeration. You would think if your listeners are as surprised as I am to learn all this stuff, it's like, wait, my manager never even had training about how to manage people? The answer is probably not. That's actually what it is. And even if they did have a training, it often had to do with managing things instead of leading people. So it might be like, here's how you fill out the performance review instead of how to actually deliver the constructive feedback to people. And I think I like to think in part because of our work, my thinking, Hamza's thinking, we are very open about pushing towards more human-centric leadership. And we're not the only ones. And I think that that's why, alongside with just a collective consciousness raising in the entire society around things like mental health, around things like, hey, this does not leave you when you walk into work. It's still your brain. Like these things, right. I think there's been a whole level of collective consciousness raising about that. So I guess what am I saying here is, yes, one, that is a hard part of business, but increasingly a more important part of business. And I think you'd be right to be noticing the transformation from what I would call a transactional style of leadership, more hierarchical down, to a more open organizations and a more transformational, and what I would even push towards is transcendent style of leadership that does flatten the relationship between the leader and the followership, so leadership and followership, and is truly about people development towards meeting the aims of the organization. And I promise you that you'll have profitability too. I'm not worried about that if you are putting people first.
Your initial comments I use a different example, but it always interests me when people are really good at a job. And then they think, why am I doing this job and making somebody else money? Why don't I go and do my own thing? Not realizing that all of the other stuff that comes with that, you might not be good at. Right. So the example that I always use is a plumber, right? Somebody who's a brilliant plumber, does great work, is efficient, goes to work every day and says, why am I making this company all of this money when I can just go do my own thing? And then they realize that now they're managing people, they're managing fleets, they're managing logistics, they're managing books, they're managing financials, they're managing a business, they're managing all of the communications, marketing, everything else. And they're not good at that stuff. They're really good at being a plumber. And I think taking that to what your example is internally as business owners, we see that sometimes. We see the person doing a really good job and we say they should be the head of that department because they do a really good job at that. And then all of a sudden, to your point, they don't have all of the other soft skills to be the head of that department. And then we're scrambling.
And I would tell leaders these days, no. You're going to want to promote the person who's good at teaching and good at people skills. Or if you want to promote the one who has good technical talent, make sure you put them through an extremely robust soft skills program.
Right.
And I would then tell that leader who has soft skills, every single person on your team should be better at the technical than you. Like, I should absolutely be hiring people who are better at technical skills than I am. Right.
Yeah. I always say I'm not doing my job if I know how everything works in the organization. Right. I don't know. Yeah.
So, it's a funny thing. I mean, I get to see two sides of it because I myself am an entrepreneur. And so I have my own parts of business that are hard, but we also get the dual benefit of going into businesses and talking to leaders about the challenges that they're having. And for us, it's mostly in the world though of like people and leadership and anything to do with that. Not so much would we be brought in to balance the books or something like that.
Right. So we've gotten through. We've got you to the point now where in our story, in the journey, where you've got we've identified a speaker. You've done your PhD. You've got
Working on it.
the company. Oh yeah, working on your PhD. Yeah, or is that
I
close?
like where
Or
you're going with this. I'm supposed to graduate next December, so I still a little bit left, but I got to stay motivated.
Yeah. And that does become the hardest part. So what's next? What do you see? So you did hint at teaching professor. Your eyes kind of lit up when you mentioned that earlier as kind of a backup plan. I kind of feel like that might end up not being a backup plan, but part of the plan eventually. Yeah.
Right now it's a backup plan because we have big plans. I do have big plans. Yeah.
So tell, are you able to share or?
Sure. I mean,
what's next?
Well, yeah, I can share some of it, not all of it though. But basically, Skills Camp right now, depending on when this is published, I have had the trouble as an entrepreneur, which I like to think is a better problem to have. My outward persona of the business has not kept pace with what we are actually doing and the services we are actually offering very successfully. So which, like I said, I think it's a better problem to have that our website is not up to date and we have business than a good website and no business. But
right, sure.
I still need to work on that. So we are actually going to be, I suppose, growing up Skills Camp to its next phase and creating. We're going to have we have a parent organization, Hamza and I, called the Universal Skills Group, of which Skills Camp will be one of the components of it. And then we're working with some global partners potentially on an AI powered solution for leadership. But that's all I'll say right now. That is particularly what I study in my doctorate, actually, is how generative AI can support transformational leaders. So that's kind of what we're thinking about in a bigger way right now.
And so I'm going to completely 180 here just because you said it. Sure. What are you finding? What are the opportunities? Like if we look at business leaders and the impacts of generative AI and artificial intelligence in general, what do you see? Like it's so interesting to me, kind of converting the conversation of soft skills, which I consider to be very human, very intuitive and like emotional intelligence. And you start talking about artificial intelligence, those two things are just they're not the same. So where is that crossover? Where is that opportunity?
I actually feel like this could be an entire other podcast. This is like my favorite.
Sure. Yeah. Maybe that's what we need to do.
It seems counterintuitive at first. How could artificial intelligence extend what you've considered human intelligence? I no longer call these human skills. And the part of the reason is because what we are able to say, for example, something we teach at Skills Camp is empathy in practice. And what we do is break down skills into their requisite components, as well as how they appear to other humans, and then build those up in another person. And frankly, artificial intelligence does the exact same thing. So I could again, there's a lot to explain here. So I'm really giving you just like the top level of what AI could do. Your listeners might not even understand what AI can fully do right now, because generative AI is not at, it's causing some fear in people too. So, but what I could do is absolutely create a large language model that learns to respond in the same way that I teach a human to respond empathetically. Now, obviously we could get into this is what you're saying, but we get into philosophical debates about feelings. And eventually we will end up at the question, what does it mean to be human? Everyone, you're going to end up at the question, what does it mean to be human? Let me just tell you where this conversation ends now. And it's my favorite conversation. It's my favorite conversation. But what I'm finding so far, and how I think it'll be useful for everyone right now to conceptualize generative AI. One, I actually call it internally, I call it collected intelligence. my goal is to get AI to collective intelligence, but we're not there yet. And humans have been collecting intelligence as long as we've been around. It's part of the success of our species. I would argue that this is where we were always going. We collected it in a book and taught it to others. We collected it on a stone tablet, in a library, in a computer, and taught it to others. AI collected intelligence is now allowing us to extend that in the way that we actually talk and the way that we actually create. And that could be a little bit scary, but it seems to me to actually have a very natural connection to the world of learning and education, because how can we extend our intelligence when I'm no longer with you? That's one. Two, it is right now still very much like seen as a technological tool. Okay. So there is a long history of leaders using tools and communication and internet communication technology tools for better leadership, for better human-centric leadership, to be fair. And my dissertation is quite literally, a whole section of it is on for transformational leadership, which inherently is the leadership style that is built on the leveling and the focus on people and development and relationships. So early exploration is that I think generative AI is going to be able to support leaders in things like giving feedback, in understanding cross-cultural implications, understanding intergenerational dynamics, being able to communicate assertively and not aggressively, being able to, I feel like I could literally go on and on. Almost every single skill we have could be supported in some way by our collected intelligence. And so that is early thinking on it. But honestly, you got to let me conduct my study first, and then I'll tell you what I literally found.
Yeah. No, and I look forward to that. So just one piece that I'll kind of provide my where my thought process went is when you said empathy, and I mean that in and of itself, the word empathy, to try and understand how as much data as an AI engine might have, how can it actually derive empathy of any kind. When I was doing my leadership stream in my MBA, one thing that I learned, that I was really intrigued about, was this taking empathy to the next level. And actually the terminology that they used was perspective taking. So not just being empathetic in the situation, but actually being able to plant yourself in the other's shoes and look at the world from their perspective, look at the conversation you're having, like truly perspective taking from the other folks around you. And that would be challenging it's challenging for I think it's challenging. I think it's challenging for human beings to do it. I couldn't imagine training an AI model to try and take perspective. But
I know it's going to sound very theoretical for a lot of people. I thought you were going to say the opposite, and then I'll tell you why.
Interesting.
But come with me into what I think will be the future.
Please. Please.
I am very aware of where current people are. So let me understand is like, let me tell you, like, I'm not grounded in these, but I like to philosophize. So I'm glad that we're going here. I think there is a version of this in the future where AI perhaps does a better job of taking your perspective than I ever could, actually. And the reason why is because, and I'm literally saying this out loud, by the way, so I'm kind of thinking as we go.
Sure.
But I know that large language models right now are already working on how does Trevor think? What has gone on in Trevor's life? And let's say we're, 20 years in the future and you've had a personal assistant AI for a very long time. And this has collected the intelligence of your life. It actually could theoretically do a better job of telling and explaining your perspective to me than I ever could. Because it is taking in the same data of your life that you are taking in. Although, like I said, that's a theory. However, I like to talk about bodily intelligence as well. Body intelligence is not fully explored in humanity quite yet. We don't fully, completely understand it or even give it a name of like, what is the intelligence of the body? That would be something that couldn't be replaced in AI, which means I think it's going to demand more research soon.
Yeah. That was an easy sell. I think you got me on that one. Especially, I mean, it would depend on the individual. It would depend on the scenario. Like having an AI assistant for 20 years, like you said, would give
kind of far in the future, right?
amount of data. But for me, I mean, it wouldn't take much for an AI to look at all of my writing and like everything that's out on the internet. It's out there and available, and could easily get kind of my perspective on or apply what it would think to be my perspective, and maybe be fairly accurate in any situation. So
probably more accurate than your
fascinating.
therapist.
Right. No, I hear what you're saying. Yeah, and that was really the piece that, I wasn't suggesting that it's easy for people to practice perspective taking.
For sure.
In fact, it's profoundly difficult.
Very much so.
But to think that it could actually be easier with the right amount of data, and for a system to be able to do that is fascinating.
Yeah. But I like talk. I don't want to. That was very far in the future. In the current version of reality, you are right that all that we can do right now is empathy in practice is what the only thing I could actually teach even a human. I could say, here, I could teach you about perspective taking, and we can actually exercise it. For example, one of the things that we do in that program is like, how do you build up empathy? Someone might be like, how do you build it up in a human? A good portion of empathy you might not realize is actually creativity. Can you imagine you look at someone out on the street? Here's an exercise I might give someone. Look at someone out on the street and create 3 stories for why they look the way that they look. 3. So they're sitting on a bench, and sometimes I make them do it and I give them a photo and I say, create 3 possible explanations for why someone is sad in this photo. And I tell them, that is empathy. Which story are you going to choose when you don't have all the information? And are you going to choose the story that best serves your connection or that doesn't?
Right. Yeah. And then from the humanities side, you start exploring, biases that are written into those stories and all the things that come with that. And you can start unpacking a lot there. And
sure can.
And that's where, that's where leadership now, like you were talking about, some of the immediate applications of kind of what you're researching. And another thing that I studied was incivility and just kind of those microaggressions that people aren't necessarily aware of. And it comes so easily through email. And those are the types of things. Those are the types of things I think where AI is going to go, seriously, do you want to write this? Like maybe just step back from this email because the person receiving this is not going to be appreciative, right? It could be fully unintentional.
To identify passive aggression.
Yeah,
AI
exactly.
can already do more than that. Can already do that, maybe even a little bit better than many humans.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Because we're just not in tune with it all the time. And it's our own mind space, like our own situation, in immediate situation that doesn't allow us to necessarily have, full line of sight. So, Bailey, I feel like I know that we could unpack this for a whole another hour. I know that I will get you back once you've done a little more research and really talk about how that future looks like for business leaders on the AI front. But for now, I really, really appreciate your time today. This was absolutely phenomenal. I've really enjoyed it, and I look forward to having you back at some point.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation. I'll be thinking about this when I leave.
That's awesome. Thanks, Bailey.
Okay, thank you.